So today we are commemorating 100 years in Bulhoek, and they were killed by the South African police back then.
In 1921, 24th of May. It is not known the exact number of people who died. The numbers range from 160 plus or 200 plus. But even that is actually an indictment, because what it means is that the people didn't matter enough to be recorded meticulously and to be identified properly by the powers that be. One of the ironies is that as they were dancing, worshipping, the Union police at that time under General Truta mistook some of the dances for war dances, then gave the order to shoot. But I think it's important to understand the backdrop to Bulhoek, because tensions had been rising between the Israelites and their leader Enoch Mgijima and the police and the farmers in the surrounding area, because the farmers saw Mgijima and members of his church as invaders who were coming to settle in so-called crown land. Of course, if you ask Mgijima and members of that community, they would tell you who the invaders were and who the settlers were. So land was a very central issue in that conflict. And this is, of course, less than 10 years after the infamous 1913 Land Act became law. This is just a few years after the ending of the First World War, and just a few years after the ending of the influenza epidemic. So it was a very troubled time in more ways than one for the people there and people elsewhere in the country.
And one looks at the leader, Enoch Mgijima, who himself spoke about trouble coming, trouble looming.
Well, he certainly was grappling with the meaning of all these events that were happening, and he was trying to make sense of it all. But above all, I think what Enoch Mgijima was wrestling with was having seen so much dying and so much loss of life, loss of land, loss of hope, loss of identity. His prophecies were an attempt to help make sense, if you like, of these calamities that were happening. And he predicted that more was still coming, because he wasn't able to see how black people in particular could get out of the hole in which they were.
Missionaries were quite active there.
Oh, yeah. No, missionaries were very active in the Eastern Cape, but all over the country, really. It was part of what you could call the missionary era. The protest against missionary control of the churches started already in the 1870s. There was African fatigue with missionary control, with being led by missionaries. The so-called Ethiopian churches were rising all over the place, and Mgijima is therefore not alone during that era. There is, of course, shortly after Mgijima, there's the story of Nonteta Nkwenkwe, who also was a prophet, was trying to help people deal with Umbatalala, and she was declared mad by the authorities of the day, sent to mental asylum, eventually taken to Vescopis in Pretoria, where she died. I think we've got to understand the context out of which prophets rise.
It seemed to me that there was also a yearning to return to self.
You can go back to the year 1700, 1701, in what is today Angola, but at that time there was no difference between Angola and the DRC.
Yes.
At least in that area where it's the border between the two. There was a young woman called Kimpa Vita who converted to Catholicism, but immediately rejected huge chunks of Catholicism. So, for example, she decided to teach her followers that Jesus was black, and so were his disciples. And she started a whole movement which actually taught that the Congo kingdom, which had been destroyed by colonialists, would be restored. And because of that, she was arrested and, of course, burnt at the stake. What happens with the prophets is that they become some kind of lightning rod in whose bodies and in whose minds and whose souls the cumulation of all the problems that are happening in society at that time, they come together. The political problems, the cultural problems, the problems of public health, in this case, when we're talking about Mgijima, the loss of land, the loss of identity. So you'll find one or two people who become, if you like, the nerve center of all those problems. And that's how you have prophets. So prophets, we mustn't blame prophets. We must blame the conditions that produce them and analyze those conditions.
Why this Bulhoek Massacre was so suppressed for so long?
There are probably many layers to that response, because partly you could argue that this was way before the days when the mass media in this country was as well developed as we have come to know it. So things happening in a rural corner of the country somewhere did not look like national news. It certainly didn't look like national news to the government of the day. They would not be interested in making sure that what happened there is known. I don't know if you know Miriam Makeba's song about Soweto. I think the lyrics were written by Yuma Sikela, where she talks about just a little atrocity without any publicity. They wanted to keep it like a little atrocity without any publicity. And of course, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have mobile phones with cameras. And for that reason, at that time, it didn't become as big news as possible, but it suited the government of the day for it to happen like that. You know, you could blame our current government a little bit in the sense that, I mean, Enoch Mgijima should be celebrated a little more than, because he was not just a church leader. He was not just a prophet. He was also a black leader who, in his own way, was trying to advance the same agenda that the South African National Native Congress of 1912, when it was formed, was advancing, because land was a very central issue at that time. So I don't know that we can blame others. We should also blame ourselves. You could argue that South African history can be told in terms of massacres. So you can go back to 1857, 1858, 1856, Unongause. Now, Unongause, I argue that what happened around Unongause was a massacre. It was a massacre because although it may have started with Unongause saying, I had some people telling me in the river that we must slaughter cattle and so on, Sir George Grey actually took advantage of that and used the occasion to finish off the remaining Xhosa resistance and to annex even more land from the Xhosa people at that time. So the people who died there did not die merely because they didn't have food. They died because they were allowed to die. It was in the interest of Sir George Grey to see them die. Sir George Grey Massacre, I call it, not the Nongause cattle killing tragedy as it is called. And then when you come to 1900, 1904, 1906, then you have the massacre in Namibia by the Germans of the Herero and the Nama. And then, of course, you have Enoch Mgijima and the Israelites.
What led him to occupy that specific piece of land?
Well, the same reason that Lekanyane occupied Tabahona in Polokwane and made it his Jerusalem, his sacred land for him and his people. Same reason that many of the prophets would find a spot which they would want to preserve for ritual activities. I could give many examples of such sacred places that are chosen. But you've got to understand this in the context of a time when land was being taken away from black people. When people have no land, how and where do they worship? How and where do they connect with their ancestors? How and where do they make a living? He needed that land for all of the above reasons. He had been using land adjacent to that for a long time, but in collaboration with the Moravian missionaries who had their own place there. But as his followers and the numbers grew, he needed more and more space.
Because there were intimidations coming along over time, were there not?
Yes, there was a lot of toing and froing between Mgijima, his brother, and the leaders of his church, and Truta and those who represented him and who represented the union government, basically trying to feebly negotiate with them to try and get them to move away from the land. And of course, Mgijima and his followers were quite adamant that they were not going to move, because they were going to move away to go where? In the context of the 1913 Land Act. It was part of the squeeze, really. They knew exactly what was happening. So there was a lot of toing and froing. They sent emissaries, but none of the emissaries were going there to say to Mgijima, maybe stay here, but follow this and that rules, or this is the process in terms of which these lands can belong to you. But Mgijima could see through it. He could see that this was not real negotiation in good faith.
Is there anything to do with the Creator or Heavenly Father or God in calling a prophet, and not just because somebody appoints themselves as a prophet?
It's not for me or you or anyone to determine whether a person who has been called by God has really been called by God. Mgijima was a tried and tested religious leader. By the time the Bulhoek Massacre happens, he has been at it for a decade and more. I think that his followers were convinced beyond any doubt that he was a prophet of God. So, the authorities of the day say Mgijima is a madman. They say Nonteta Nkwekwe is mad and she must go to mental hospital. But who is more mad between the police general who commands police to shoot people at Ntabelanga and Mgijima? Who is the more mad between them? Who's more likely to be representing God there? Who is more mad between a government that passes a law such as the 1913 Land Act and Nonteta Nkwekwe, who ends up dying at Vescopis? Who is more mad? We must be careful not to over-analyze the victims of injustice to the point of reading them outside the grace of God, while implicitly accepting your Jan Smarties and your Colonel Trutas as representatives of God. Not to recognize the depth, the complexity, the nuanced manner in which people like Enoch Mgijima, Nehemiah Tile, Enoch Mgijima, and many others, all these people have provided leadership. And it was not leadership that you could put in a box. Enoch Mgijima was a complete and comprehensive leader, seeking to intervene in food production, in land ownership, in spiritual development. Why has it taken us so long to recognize the leadership of the likes of Enoch Mgijima? I don't know. The main focus is on the Bulhoek Massacre. And we have to understand the logic, if there is any logic in massacring any people.